greet everyone here. It's really a pleasure to be here. This is the fourth time I'm doing this, and I always enjoy it greatly. I will be talking about sustainable development, which of course is the centerpiece of what UNDP does. But I'll be talking about it from the point of view of an economist. So I will talk a bit more about the economic pillar, but you know, economists, they, on the one hand, on the other hand, they talk about trade-offs, and they talk about how you can trade one against the other. So I will be doing a little bit of that. It's quite an eclectic lecture that I've put together. At the end, if we have time, I'll talk a little bit about scenario planning, which is a neat way of looking into the future. So, as you will see, we'll talk about a lot of different things. Now, let me try to get this going. So I'll give you a roadmap actually in two pieces. Here, just an overview, and right about after the 10th slide, I'll then update the roadmap. First, I will be talking about background. What is sustainable development? How it is defined? And take a little closer look, as promised, on economic sustainability. Then, as I said a bit later, I will lay out in more detail what else we will cover. Look at the many moving parts in sustainability, because it's very complex, and there are feedback loops, and there are dynamic effects, which make it interesting, but also very, very hard to actually find intervention points. And then I'll be talking about market failures. Market failures are arising from various reasons, and they are the potholes on the road. We can't rely only on the market to take care of everything. And I'll be providing you some examples of some of the reasons market failures arise, and there are, of course, others. And then, as I said, we can look into scenario analysis if we have time. So, what is sustainable development? I like to think about sustainable development like a three-legged stool. Just imagine any of the legs breaking. You topple over, right? Essentially, let me give you the definition first. It's one of the possible definitions. It's given by Arrow, who is a Nobel Prize winner, and some other co-authors. And what he says is development is sustainable if over time you're not depleting any of your capital stocks, be they human capital, physical capital, natural capital, also including oil in the ground or natural gas or other natural resources. If what you do is you live well and hopefully develop, but without undermining these capital stocks, then you have sustainable development. It's a deceptively simple definition. Of course, there is the economic, the social and environmental pillar of sustainability. So what you want is that the development that you undergo as a country is sustainable from a social point of view, so that social tensions do not build up excessively, because then they have a tendency to explode. Similarly, there is a need for economic sustainability, and I'll define that carefully for you in a moment. And environmental sustainability, which I believe there's not much need to define. You need to make sure that we continue to have clean water to drink, clean air to breathe. We have the ecosystem services that the forests and seas and lakes are providing us, and that's environmental sustainability. Now, coming to the picture of a three-legged stool, just think of Iceland. Iceland had no major environmental problems, it had no major social problems, but it ran into a huge economic sustainability issue. It was a financial issue. It had to do with Icelandic banks offering deposits at very high interest rates, and then investing that money within Iceland, and then the money evaporated because it happened to be invested in the middle of a huge financial bubble. At the end of all of this, Iceland was settled with per capita debt, which was unheard of. It was 400% of GDP, and it was just not sustainable. So the leg that buckled for Iceland was the economic one. Greece is an interesting example because Greece also started out with the economic sustainability being the primary problem. But by now, they have moved over to social sustainability. People are on the streets, huge number of people, especially young people, are unemployed, and the society has now come to a stage where tension is so high that actually that is an equally big problem for Greece. Egypt, the Arab Spring, what we have witnessed is Egypt had money. I mean, it wasn't an issue of economic sustainability. Also, not really of environmental, but the binding constraint in Egypt was social, lack of social sustainability. Maldives is an example where the environmental sustainability is the leg that is threatening to buckle. You probably heard that the Maldives government held an underwater cabinet meeting. Everyone put on some masks and oxygen supply on their backs, and they wanted to demonstrate this way that if the water levels are going to keep rising as they are threatening to rise, Maldives will be wiped off from the surface of the earth. So for different countries, it's different pillars of sustainability that are threatened. And why am I telling you all this? Because I believe this is a very good framework of thinking about the totality of all the problems that societies face and economies face. Of course, there are synergies across these. There are also trade-offs. There are across the three pillars. And there are feedback loops both within one pillar. So, for example, if you begin to go down on a downward spiral in economics, in the economic pillar, for example, you have a major government debt. Well, that means that you're in trouble if you want to finance further deficits on your budget. But if you do have some deficits, then very, very quickly the market will conclude that this is not sustainable, then the interest rate will jump up. No one will be willing to lend to that particular budget or to that particular government. And then guess what? Your deficit actually explodes because one of the expenditure items is interest. And I've seen this happen in countries and they just go under, they blow up. This is a negative feedback loop acting within the economic pillar. There are feedback loops which act across pillars. One is if you have very high poverty and you have a country where a lot of people are poor, and that country happens to be cold, then those people will have no money to buy fuel to heat their homes, so they will just cut down all the trees on the side of the hill, and next year you have a huge mudslide. So the economic issues have spilled over to environmental issues. And then, of course, there is the issue of short-term versus long-term. Sometimes what seems eminently optimal to do from a short-term point of view can be disastrous from a long-term point of view. And actually, the previous example is excellent to demonstrate that too. In the short run, you feel very cold, you have a baby, you want your home to be heated, so you cut down the tree. That was the optimal decision. Except, in the longer run, a year later, your house will be just flattened by the mud that comes down the hill. So that's short-term versus long-term for you. Now, I won't dwell too much on this, but here are the three pillars, the economic, the social, and the environmental. And what we have been doing in the past, we meaning all the eminent economists and social scientists and so on, they have been focusing on individual pillars. So there have been huge number of books published on how to do the budget, how to do monetary policy, and all the traditional growth issues on GDP and capital stock and national debt and the government's role. That was within the economic pillar. Similarly, we had social scientists who have been publishing about issues in society, and environmentalists talking happily within their little closed shop. Essentially, the interesting stuff comes in the overlaps. And I tried to summarize here what could be the overlap between these two, environmental and social. You can begin to talk about green jobs and decent jobs and the poverty environment nexus. And I mentioned to you how poverty can actually affect environmental protection. Similarly, the overlap between economic and social is inclusive growth. You want to create jobs not only for the elite. You want to create jobs for everyone, including the vulnerable. Then you want to pull in as consumers, again, not only the elite, but you want to provide goods and services to the vulnerable, because individually they only have little money to dispose over. However, in totality, because of the billions of poor there are, it's actually a huge market. So inclusive markets are a very interesting idea and something to pursue. And similarly, the economic and environmental has an overlap, and that's where people begin to talk about paying for ecosystem services, for example. Which sounds like a crazy idea, except for all the alternatives. It's actually the way to go, and I'll try to convince you about that. And then my point is, you want to be in this sweet spot. You want to say things which actually make sense from all three, from the point of view of all three pillars. And that's what sustainable development is about. Okay? Now, as I promised, let's talk a little bit about economic sustainability. This concept is useful for any unit. You can apply it to households. And actually, when someone goes to a bank and says, hey, I'd like a loan, that's exactly what the bank risk assessor will do. They will try to assess the financial sustainability of that particular household to see whether they are able to repay the loan with interest. It is also applicable to firms, enterprises, also to individual sectors. Is the tourist sector sustainable in Croatia? That's a very valid question. And the answer is, of course, yes, in that particular case. And for some other countries, as a huge sector, it may not be sustainable. And then, of course, for countries. For countries, there are actually agencies like Standard & Poor's, which assess the sustainability, in essence, of individual countries, and then they assign a rating to that. Now, the key point on the economic side is to remember cash flow is not enough. And what I mean by that is there are companies which basically are able to pay every bill that comes in, except they are not setting aside money for future investment, and thereby they are living up their capital. It's, in the household's case, it's like selling the family silver so that they can pay the bills. Is it a balanced cash flow? Yes, it is. What you need to pay, you are able to pay. That's a balanced cash flow. Is it sustainable? No, not necessarily. So that's the point about cash flow versus broader economic sustainability. What you want is to be able to cover all costs. And by all costs, I mean including capital costs, including the financing costs of previous investment, including things that you need to do so that you remain sustainable. And let me give you an example. One example would be a nuclear power station. You can say you have covered everything, but if you have not set aside money to actually pay for safe storage of the spent fuel, which actually 95% of power stations have not done, then you haven't ensured sustainability from an economic point of view. Okay, so I've given you already examples about fiscal sustainability when it's about the budget. I've also talked about banks assessing the creditworthiness of individual firms or households. Those are exercises in assessing economic sustainability. Let me give you another example. In Sweden, they have a fairly complicated pension system. They have pay-as-you-go, which means the young, when they work, they pay a contribution, and that money is directly paid out to some pensioner. They also have funded pillars, which means that people who actually worked over their lifetime, they have set aside money, and then the returns from that money are used for their own pensions. It's a mix of both, and actually they also have reserves. They have, as a government, they have set aside big amounts of money for the contingency that unexpectedly pensions will cost more in real terms than they thought. And the way they actually check is there's an annual exercise in Sweden. They just take a look at all the assets that they have and the returns based on updated information, what are the expected returns over time. And then they also take a look at all the liabilities, how many pensioners we have, what are the demographic projections, so over the next 50 years, what is the number of pensioners in each year, what are the cohorts that go into pension, and so on, what are the death rates and everything else. And then they calculate net present values, which means that you discount next year a little bit, 2 years down the road a little bit more, 50 years down the road quite a lot. You get two numbers, the discounted net present value of all assets, all the revenues from those assets, and a discounted net present value of all liabilities. And you compare the two. If the discounted net present value of all liabilities is greater, they actually adjust the pension increment so as to bring it back in balance. This they do every year based on updated information. This is a genuine exercise in financial sustainability of a unit, and that unit is the state pension system of Sweden. Okay, so that was just a definition. Now, this was economic sustainability, and this whole idea, again, please notice something really important. The interplay between stocks and flows. Flows are, for example, incomes that are generated during a given period of time, for example, a year. Stocks are something that you have at a given point in time. You have a stock of assets, for example, you have a pile of gold coins, those are stocks. You have a house, that's a stock. And those things may or may not generate income, and income is a flow. And the whole idea here is that you have to be careful about the interplay between stocks and flows. And this basic idea is the one that Arrow, in his definition that I quoted at the very beginning, has been utilizing. What he is saying, use all the flows that you generate from your capital, but make sure that you do it in a way that your stocks do not decline. That kind of interplay is what is at the heart of sustainability. Okay, you can say, this is great, this is nice fancy stuff, but our world is not static. Our world is globalized. There is a lot of interdependence between countries and firms and households and every other unit you can think of. And to add to this, we are facing a lot of different kinds of shocks. Those shocks can be grouped into two groups. One is short-term or high-frequency shocks. And those are primarily economic. There is, for example, a cyclical downturn that started in the middle of 2008, and that's one of the biggest cyclical downturns we have seen, certainly our generation, including yours, that we have seen. There is, in addition to the normal economic cycle, there's also a financial bubble that has burst, so there is a financial shock. And smart economists have figured out that when those two coincide, then the length of the downturn is, and the depth of the downturn, the recession, is much bigger. And we are just so lucky that we happen to live exactly that those two are coinciding. Then we have a roller coaster of commodity prices. I don't know if any of you have followed the oil price, for example, or energy prices, or food prices. There have been staggering volatility in these prices in both nominal and real terms. And what we see now is that there seems to be a trend within that very volatile, for that very volatile time series. Take any commodity price. Huge volatility, and there seems to be a trend towards real increase in the level. That has to do with something that I already show as a shock in the longer term or lower frequency group, and that is the rise of the sun. There is more than 1 billion Chinese, more than 1 billion Indians who are beginning, and a lot of Africans, who are now beginning to live a life that is closer to the life that is lived by Western Europeans or Northern Americans. And this is great, this is good. There is one minor problem, that if they actually try to travel exactly the path that in the past 200 years those Western Europeans and Northern Americans have traveled, it is so resource intensive that in aggregate it's just not available. That kind of growth path is not available for 3 billion more people. This is, please understand me, this is not a statement of what is right or wrong. It's a statement of fact. There is an institute in California which is following this, and they call themselves the Global Footprint Institute. Just Google them. And what they do is they try to take the footprint of the average person in each country. And a very simple exercise that they do is that they take the average footprint, environmental footprint of an American. And then they say, okay, let's assume that China in 10 years, China, all the BRICS, and Africa will be at that level, at the average of Americans today. Well, there's one minor problem. That would require 4 Earths. And last time I counted, there is only 1. This kind of constraint is something that if we continue growing the way we do, we are going to hit the constraint. And it's not about right or wrong, it's about reality. Okay, so from this slide, please remember, we are in a world which is interdependent because it's highly globalized. People are traveling all over the place. Capital is going like this from one continent to another, and then again, the next day maybe to a third. Everything is in motion. And the quantities are so huge that they have an impact on both the sending and the receiving. And we have a confluence of shocks. So this is the background. So now the promised roadmap, the second half of the roadmap. I will now provide sustainable development vision. What could actually work? And the bottom line of that is rely on the market, because I'm from Hungary. I can tell you my country and a lot of others in this part of the world have tried the alternative, saying we don't want the market, we will have central planning, our wise people with big computers will figure out who needs to do what. You produce shoes, you produce boots, and then everything will be fine. We tell you exactly what you need to do, and then everything is great. Except it was a major disaster. The information need for this is so huge that there is no way that you can get updated information in time to do this kind of exercise. Whereas the market actually is a decentralized set of people reacting to price signals. And you don't have to tell them, please follow your own self-interest. They do that anyway. If the price signals are right, then more or less the market will be the biggest engine that will drive you towards sustainability. Is that the end of the answer? No, because the market fails. There are instances where the market fails and you are trying to rely on this mechanism, and you find that horrible things happen. Forests are cut down in Brazil. There is pollution in rivers because in following their self-interest, some companies will just pollute the rivers. The fish stock will be depleted from the sea because everyone tries to get as much fish as possible, not thinking about the future. So the answer has to be a patchwork, and I'll get to that a little bit in greater detail. Rely on the market. That's a huge engine, the best we have. But it's a very ineffective, no, it's effective. It's a very, in itself, it's not sufficient. You actually have to worry about market failures, information failures, coordination failures, and you have to get a patchwork of policies that will try to act on each of these. You will never get to 100%, but you will get to a fairly high percentage of actually addressing problems. So what are these market failures and how can they be dealt with? I'll talk about that, but there is a very important aspect, and that is rebalancing the role of the state and the private sector. And I'll talk a bit more on this. There is a horizon mismatch. Again, I will talk about it, but let me just introduce you to the idea. Actually, I've already mentioned it. Sometimes some people make decisions which are perfectly sensible and optimal from a point of view of someone who has a horizon of 2 months. However, the same decision is utterly stupid and ununderstandable for someone who has a horizon of 2 decades. This is the kind of debate that mothers have with politicians. The politician only cares about the next election. wants to be re-elected. I refuse to agree with a lot of people who say politicians are stupid. They just don't understand. This is wrong. Politicians are very smart people. But they're optimizing on a short horizon. And then there is the mother with a little kid who says, my horizon is 80 years. I want to make sure, actually, it's much, much longer, because not only do I want to make sure my little kid actually grows up in a world that is a nice world, a pleasant one, environmentally safe, and so on, but also my child's child, my grandchildren and great-grandchildren. And when these two get together, both of them are talking about optimal decisions, but there will be precious little overlap. Now, many things can be done in this respect, and I'll mention a few. And then I've already mentioned getting pricing right. And then if I have time, I'll talk a little bit about how you can look into the future without getting dizzy. And by this I mean, at any given point in time, like now, just imagine how many different possible futures there are. Infinite, right? Now, so how do you actually get a grip on that? You can't possibly do infinite number of calculations into the future. You have to find some way of representative futures, a very small number, that taken together actually cover most of the possible eventualities. And that's what this is going to be about. So let me talk a little bit about rebalancing the roles of the state and the private sector for sustainable growth. There is a distinct and well-defined role for both the government and the state in an ideal setting. The government needs to contain economic imbalances, like it should not run big deficits. That's for a very good reason, and then for a short time. Keynesian interventions are one such possibility. Actually, what has been done during this downturn globally in the world is a much smarter set of interventions than what has been done in the Great Depression in 1929. Actually, there was a big expansion of fiscal deficits, and while economists generally do not like fiscal deficits, it was a good idea in most countries. And why was it a good idea? Because a downturn means there's a huge drop in aggregate demand. And someone needs to step in and lift that aggregate demand, and it was the government. Now, you can't do this forever, because then every year you're running a deficit, you have to finance it, you're adding to your debt. And this is the kind of problem that many countries are now hitting. Greece at the top of the list and several others. There's also a role for government in containing social tensions. There's a role for social safety nets. On social safety nets, we've done some research, and I'll be happy to talk about it for hours if you like. The idea is not that you have to have one single social protection program that does everything. The idea is, again, a patchwork. You need to have some social programs at the central level which catch most of the people. If you try to catch everyone with those central level programs, it will just cost you. It will be prohibitively expensive. So you just live with the fact that you catch 85% of people who need to be caught. And 15% fall through the cracks. And then you come in at the local level. Why is it better at the local level for this smaller number of people? Because there's an information advantage at the local level. In small villages, if someone says, hey, I'm poor, pay me, they will know. Come on, you're not poor, you have money. That person is poor. This kind of information advantage can be used, but it cannot be overused. That's why there is a need for central level programs and there is a need for local level programs. Taken together, again, this will not be 100%, but they will be far more effective, but also far more efficient from a financial point of view if you have this kind of social protection system. And that's what I meant by improving the targeting of the system rather than individual social protection programs. Government has a very clear role in ensuring the preservation and enhancement of human capital. That's just a fancy way of saying that there is a need for healthcare, there is a need for education. Government should subsidize and should cover the costs of primary education and perhaps secondary. When it comes to university level education, that creates private wealth. You go home, all the education you got after a university, that's your private wealth. You are going to get better jobs and higher pay. So there is less of a case for subsidizing high-level studies than low-level studies. This is not to say that there should not be a role for government in facilitating people to study at university level, but that has to be highly targeted, and also maybe the role should be through making available reasonable cost funding for high levels. Government has a role in regulating. It has to regulate the financial system. It has to regulate activities that have externalities like environmental pollution. But it has to regulate sparingly. And again, my country, Hungary, and your country, Bulgaria, are excellent examples when the government tried to over-regulate. And that's not going to work. It's actually highly inefficient. And then the government has a role in ensuring access to law and access to property rights. And Hernando de Soto is one of the champions of the thinking why property rights are incredibly important. And again, I can talk about this if anyone is very interested. But then there's the private sector. That's what I said. The market has a major role to play. The private sector can drive growth. Ideally, it is a broad-based, inclusive type of growth, which provides affordable goods and services to all, and also employment to all, and also entrepreneurial possibilities to all. Employment and employability. Employability has to do with education, but also health. Employment has to do with broad-based growth. Social inclusion is critical, and I'm sure you have discussed this. We have written a report. Andrei was a lead author of the Regional Human Development Report on social inclusion in our region. And this actually is not just talk. You can actually measure it. You can come up with specific policy recommendations on how social inclusion can be increased. And again, the private sector has a major role to play here. And Muhammad Yunus, who I mentioned in the last line, another Nobel Prize winner. I had the privilege of working with him for 3 days earlier this year, and he has brilliant ideas on how the private sector can actually engage in something called social enterprises, and how wonderful interventions can be made to make the lives of actually millions much, much better. Now, I'll talk about market failures. And this is my attempt at showing you that it has to be by wedges. There is no single silver bullet. If someone stands up in front of you and says, hey guys, I know, you just need to do this thing and then everything is resolved, just laugh that person out of the room. That's never going to work. But there is, let me talk a little bit about a very famous article. It was written by Princeton academics, professors. What they talked about is whether we can actually handle global climate change. Do we have the technology? And their answer was exactly along these lines. No, we don't have individual technologies, but we have wedges. We have one technology that can take out X billion tons of carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. There's another one which can take out this much, and so on. And what they built up was in totality sufficient to actually address, more than sufficient, to address the issue of carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gas emissions. And those were existing technologies. Those were not things that were just figments of people's imagination. Those were existing technologies. And my point about the policies on how you actually address the market failures and how you help the market become the driver of sustainable development relies on the same idea. This was actually chapter 2 of the regional report that UNDP has issued prior to Rio +20, the big environmental conference that was held 2 weeks ago. And in that chapter 2, what I wrote is that you can have a patchwork of policies. which addresses individual market failures, and then, together with the market, you can actually get on a path of sustainable development. So, as I promised, there are problems in how the market works. Optimization level is one problem. If there is a government and it tries to just really very honestly do the best it possibly can to reduce poverty, for example, if it's done individually in each country, it will not be optimal globally. Just think, in Luxembourg, a person who earns under $20,000 per year is a poor person. So what should the Luxembourg government do? It should take resources and try to help the people who earn less than $20,000 per year. Is that optimal from a global point of view? Hell no. I mean, you should take that money and you should lift people who live on $600 a year. And you can actually be more efficient because you can lift 15 or 20 people from the same amount of money that you could lift one person out of poverty, relative poverty, in Luxembourg. And the overall happiness of the world will be much, much higher. So individual optimization is not always equal to global optimization. And this was basically a point about the marginal gain for investing $1 in addressing any single problem. There is also, when you optimize at the national level about issues that have very clear externalities in other countries, then you actually may even worsen the situation globally. And Central Asia is an excellent example for that on water. There are the upstream countries. The upstream countries in Central Asia decided that, well, we want to generate electricity using the energy from water in the winter, because that's when it is cold. We want the electricity then. So then what do? The upstream countries just let all the water go down to the downstream countries in the winter. Downstream countries engage in agriculture. What do they want? They want irrigation water. Guess when? Not in the winter, they want it in the summer. So if individually the upstream countries optimize, they do exactly the wrong thing for the downstream countries. And vice versa. If you try to optimize for the downstream countries only, then you have something which is suboptimal for the upstream countries. And this is just a very simple example, unfortunately, a deadly serious example for Central Asia, and probably for many other countries. And then I've already talked about politicians, whether they are short-sighted or stupid, and the answer is no. It's a matter of horizon. So let me just give you a very simple, like I said, this is from the eyes of an economist. So you look at, this is basically, just think of this as a reform project. And what you have is front-loaded costs. In the first year, there's a whole lot of costs associated with that reform. And then subsequent years, it will sort of go down, maybe go up a little bit later. Now you compare this to the benefit. Well, not much in the first year. It will take time for the benefits to build up. But do they build up? Oh yes, sure they do. And every single year after the second month, benefits already outweigh the cost. And then when you look at the cumulative benefits, it's a no-brainer. You should do this reform, right? Now think, who takes the decision? Well, it's politicians. Parliament, government, the cabinet, they will take the decision. And assume that there is an election in 2 years. Here. And they will be accused. Hey guys, you have wasted money. You have just a bit of benefit and you have spent a whole lot of money. You're no good. You should be out. And in the political debate, it will be awfully hard to talk about things in the future. And it does not happen. These kinds of projects, in general, do not happen. Sometimes they do, and there are good reasons why they do, and we need to make sure that the institutions and the moral values and whatever else comes together to actually make these things happen, that they become stronger. Okay, so this was just an example, really real-life example of a reform project where perfectly sensible people come to totally opposing optimal solutions depending on their horizon. So, what can you do about it? Actually, political parties, as much as most people don't like them, they are an institution to lengthen horizons. Political parties have something called reputation. It is different from individual politicians. It is society's attempt at actually reconciling this horizon issue. Is it perfect? No. Is it better than nothing? Probably yes, if done right. Reputational, I'm hedging my bets, I know. If you can come up with a better way, I'll be very happy to listen to it. Repeated games in game theory actually give rise to reputational effects. So there's a theoretical underpinning for this. Reputational effects can also be reinforced by media. People can be shamed on television. Hey, you are not taking that wonderful reform step which could help our children and grandchildren because you're short-sighted. That can contribute to the pressure and actually make reforms go through. Academic research and think tanks have played a role, and civil society has a role to play. Civil society can be a watchdog. We actually had a wonderful project in Kyrgyzstan where we asked civil society to just take a checklist, 60 questions, and they went to individual utilities. And basically, they gave a report card. Does this utility act in the interest of society? And it was remarkably effective in addressing a few of the really glaring shortcomings that those utilities have. And again, you can see what I am building is a patchwork. I'm not telling you there's one single thing you should remember and then everything is taken care of. What I'm saying is there are many, many problems. They are at the same time, many, many shops. And for each you can dream up something you can do. And you need to build a patchwork of your reactions. And that patchwork has to, of course, act on things you can change, not try to act on outcomes that you cannot. And then you also have to worry about the interplay of the individual remedies. Just like in medicine, you take one pill for headache, another pill for high blood pressure, a third pill because you have a knee that hurts. They can interact. Very similar in economics. There is a similar interaction. Actually, a very famous Hungarian economist by the name of János Kormai wrote a book about this, about the similarities of medical science and economic science. Another solution for this horizon issue that I mentioned is peer pressure across countries. You can have peer pressure in the EU. The EU can say, well, all these countries are doing really well, but this country is awful. That is actually a very powerful effect on politicians. Similarly, in the UN, there are UN conventions, there are treaties that countries can actually sign and then therefore connect to. And here, this is an issue of committing. There's another strand of the economic literature which talks about how hard it is to credibly commit to sound policies. And these treaties and conventions, they are committed devices. Let me just change the topic a little bit. This is another very simple logic that shows you that the market can fail, or this is not really the market failing, it's a failure of collective action. Just imagine that you have two groups. The two groups have opposing agendas. One group is huge, millions of people. The other group is small, 5 enterprises. 5 enterprises want to drill oil in Alaska, for example. And then there are many millions who say, well, no, we want a national reserve there. Now, the individual payoff for those millions, for every one of them, the payoff is far in the future, that there will be a nice Alaska 50 years from now. And maybe they gain, because they go once or twice in a lifetime to Alaska. Now compare that to the gains of the companies. If they actually get this thing through, they will get huge amounts of profits from the oil. So individually, the payoffs are huge. Now comes the trick. The conclusion. That for this reason, small lobbies, which have huge immediate gains, they often prevail over large number of people who individually have a small amount to gain, individually per capita. Even if cumulatively you just add up what do those millions gain in total, and you compare that with how much those companies gain, the companies cumulatively gain much, much less. They actually screw up the environment. And the big group gains cumulatively much, much more. But because the individual incentives are not that strong for them, the small group will prevail. That's a coordination failure. It's a different kind of failure. Mansour Olson, University of Maryland, wrote about this, a great book. And it's a very simple thought. And this has been happening over and over and over in many different situations. There are, of course, complications. This is just a very simplistic picture. And then there are complications that costs and benefits are materializing across generations. Sometimes the costs only materialize in the next generation, or the benefits do. And then, if it's played in the political arena, people who don't vote, they don't matter for politicians. That's why you have far stronger protection from the political side for pensioners than for children. Okay, so that's another failure. This is a failure of collective action. So how can you go, what can you do by way of solution? You can create institutions. Trade unions, civil society are institutions that actually, again, nudge the actors toward transparency and toward a better solution. And I'll talk subsequently about local community self-management. There is a Nobel Prize winner, the first Nobel Prize winner who is a woman in economics. Unfortunately, she died last week, but she had very powerful ideas, so I'll talk about that. Solution can also come from academic research and as I mentioned already, from the role of the media. Here is Elinor Ostrom, Nobel Prize winner. She studied common property regimes. Think of a little lake which is adjacent to 2 or 3 villages, a couple of hundred people in total. The issue is very simple, again, stocks and flows. If you want to maximize the flow of fish from the lake and an income for yourself, you just overfish like hell. You just take all the fish out you can in the next 2 weeks. But that's horrible for the stocks because the stock of fish will drop and then eventually there will be no fish in the lake. What Elinor Ostrom has done was to carefully analyze these kinds of situations. And what she found is that actually there has been a solution all along. In traditional societies, there are community norms of consensus decision making that actually guide this. Now, her major contribution was not really this. Her major contribution was that she gave a list of prerequisites when this can work in a stable manner, and those are the 8 prerequisites. And again, individually, you would say, yeah, of course, that makes sense. You have to be able to enforce the rules. You have to have effective monitoring. You have to know what's going on. Are the fish being taken out or are they not? And then if you know if they are taken out, you have to know who it is who is breaking the rules. And then you have to enforce those rules. And there are graduated rules. You take out 1 fish, you get a slap on the hand. You take out half a ton of fish, you're out of the community forever. And there has to be low cost and effective conflict resolution mechanisms. And her point was that this works on the small scale, but very often the small scale can be, large scale can be built up as a lot of small scale. And that's the last point. That there can be nested layers of such small community approaches that can actually handle common property regimes in seas, for example. And this actually can work across countries if built the right way. But unfortunately, on a global scale, we don't have examples yet. But this is a very promising way of handling things. Let me make another very important point. In making sure that the market actually is the major driving force for the kind of changes we need for sustainable development, you should not concentrate on quantities, which is central planning, what central planning has been trying to do. And as I told you, I don't believe in that stuff, and nobody much believes in it anyway. Except Rio Plus 20 was all about quantities. How many millions of tons can this country emit? Instead, you should be focusing on prices. Those are the signals. Those are the guiding signals for all private actions. And by all private actions, I mean consumption, I mean investment, local, today's decisions and future decisions. And once you get the pricing right, you will, again, this in itself is not going to solve the problem. I can assure you, if you don't get the pricing right, you're screwing up the environment. So get the pricing right and then worry about the market failures. That's the recipe. And getting pricing right for natural resources has to start with the first fundamental rule of crisis resolution. When in a hole, stop digging. And what I mean by that, stop doing the stupid things. And one of the stupid things that are being done are subsidies. They're actually positively screaming in everybody's face, please do not save gasoline, please do not save on carbon emitting sources of energy. How do we do that? Because through the subsidies. We are artificially making the prices lower for those. That's what I call a stupid approach, and at least stop that kind of stupid approach and begin to set the prices right. Even if you stop all subsidies, the prices for fossil fuel will still not be right. And why is that? Because then they will reflect all the cost of producing it, but they will not reflect the externalities that you impose when you drive a car from one place to another on future generations, because you're changing the climate through carbon emissions. These kinds of externalities also can be handled through prices, but they require a tax. That's in addition to getting rid of the subsidies. But getting rid of the subsidies is an excellent first step. There are all kinds of complications that I don't have time to get into. I'll be very happy to talk to any one of you if you're interested in the complications on how you can get rid of it. But let me make one more point on this. This is actually one of the rare instances where, by doing the right thing, you actually create the fiscal space for offsetting possible negative impact. And that was very fancy for a very simple thought. If you stop the subsidies, you no longer have to give away money from the budget. You have additional resources left. Those resources can be used to actually offset the income effect of higher energy prices on the poor. Can they be offsetting the income effect on everybody? No, because then you continue to subsidize. But in my book, if someone has 50 Hummers and wants to drive them around, fine. But they should pay the price. They should pay the normal price, including the tax on to compensate for the externality. So that's the idea about getting the prices right. Let me leave you with one thought, and then if I have time in 5 minutes, I can quickly go through the scenario planning part.
Actually, you have time because it's until 11 for to
yeah,
break.
Okay. All right. So I'll try to finish in 10 minutes. This is a very important thought. Every politician will tell you, well, the problem is, should we do something about global warming, about climate change, or should we not? And I'm telling you, this is wrong. That's not the choice. in one way or another, 100 years from now, humanity will have a small global footprint. I was very much criticized for this. When I first wrote this down, everyone said, oh, you can't say this. This is definitive. How do you know the future? and I told them, I do. The only question is how we get there. Either we adjust now and then we can get there on a relatively smooth path, or we just keep going and then we hit a constraint. And my answer was, well, I carefully counted last night how many Earths there are. I have gotten to one and I haven't found any more. Therefore, I can tell you this is a binding constraint. And I've talked to you already about the BRICS and other countries catching up, which is the right thing to do. But they will hit a global constraint. And let me just open a parenthesis here. I'm not saying they should not catch up. I am saying there is a technology available, and it is the responsibility of countries which for the past 200 years have screwed up the environment to actually transfer the new technologies to the countries so that want to catch up, so that they can catch up. And actually the market can help. But wait, will the market help? It will only help if the prices are low. See how things hang together? If the prices are right, it will be optimal to invest for the private sector in new technologies that actually use renewable energy. If the prices are wrong and we are subsidizing coal, it will be optimal. All the bean counters will show you, hey, it's optimal to invest in a new coal-fired power station, because that's the cheapest. So prices must be good. Okay. So real cost 20, in my view, was a great missed opportunity. I hope it can be undone. So far, we are on a path that we are opting for a bumpy ride. Bumpy ride meaning going, and then hitting a brick wall. Hopefully, at some point, I'm very hopeful about your generation that you will be smarter than my generation. You will find a way to actually figure out what needs to be done. And what needs to be done is effective collective action towards sustainable development. And that will get you the smoother path. You will alleviate social conflict. You will stimulate technology improvement and diffusion. And that will facilitate both adaptation and mitigation. Let me quickly talk about scenario planning. It's a favorite of mine. There's a quote, prediction is very hard, especially about the future. The guy who was a baseball coach in the US. This is the article from which I'm taking this. And it has to do about cone. We are here in the present. We're trying to look into the future. The further we look, the more things can diverge. And here is the infinite number of futures at some given time in the future that we would have to look at. And the point is very simple. I'll define scenario planning. I'll distinguish it from similar concepts, and I'll give you an example. So what is scenario planning? Instead of looking at an infinite number of scenarios stemming from the infinite number of futures, you identify a few key dimensions along which the future will the possible futures fundamentally differ. You narrow this number of dimensions down to, say, 2. Of course, there's a loss of generality here, but it can be done in a way that's actually quite powerful and useful. Then you look at a high case and a low case for each of these 2 dimensions. And you end up with 4 outcomes. Those 4 outcomes, if you have done this right, they will stand in, they will represent the infinite number of futures. If you haven't done it right, you've lost some time and some sleep over this, and then you haven't gained much. But if you actually get it right, then you can have 4 scenarios that are representative of all possible future outcomes. Then you just have 4 scenarios. You write a little story. So what is happening in that particular scenario? And then you have 4 stories, 4 possible futures to look at, and you can begin to think, do I want to get into that particular future at all? If not, then I want to avoid it at all costs. And second, well, maybe this will happen and it's not so bad, but what do I do if I am in that situation? this is a cool idea for replacing an infinite number. This is an approach that actually has been in use for quite 2 decades now. Royal Dutch Shell, Anglo-American in South Africa has used it. Actually, Anglo-American, one of the dimensions for them when they first did this in South Africa was apartheid stays, apartheid is removed. And this actually started a huge discussion in South African society, and it was one of the catalysts for eliminating apartheid. And it was really, it's a powerful story, you can read about this, that scenario planning has played a huge role in actually changing society. And of course, the Wall Street investment bankers use this a lot for deciding what kind of investment strategies are optimal. And it is taught at Wharton School, so it's fancy stuff. Now, scenario planning is not sensitivity analysis. Sensitivity analysis is when you have a model and you have all kinds of elasticities, and then you change one particular variable, changing everything constant, and then you try to see what the marginal impact is. This is not about that. It's also not about contingency planning, where you have a single eventuality you think about. For example, is there going to be an earthquake? Well, what do I do if there is no earthquake? Good, I go and have a nice beer. If there is an earthquake, I had better get some of my people know what to do, some doctors ready, some medicines ready, some equipment ready, and so on. That's contingency planning. This is more. It's also not computer simulation, where you have a highly sophisticated econometric or other kind of quantitative model, and then you manipulate some of the variables in what-if question. Instead, this is a qualitative approach. It's narrative-based, and it tries to capture the richness and range of possibilities to stimulate decision makers to consider changes that they would otherwise ignore. Okay, what you have to do then is identify key dimensions where let's try to do this for sustainable development. So find key dimensions where these will differ substantially. And then let's just go into the example. I'm not claiming this is the best possible way to do it. It was 10 last night. This is what I came up with. This is the example. You prepare for each of the core scenarios. There are, okay, let me give you the dimensions. You get sustainable development pillars roughly right. Or some of them fail to work, or the interaction doesn't work. So this is getting things right, not getting things right on sustainable development. Here, technology advances rapidly enough that actually you don't have to hit that constraint. It is a possibility, right? I said that there was one Earth. I'm not going back on that. I still tell you there is one Earth. However, there is technology that can help you limit carbon emissions. There is technology that can make the existing machinery far more efficient, and so on. So you don't have to hit the constraint. You can actually use less energy, and you can emit less carbon dioxide, while still raising growth and raising the quality of life. So that's this. And then technology doesn't go fast enough. So let's look at the 4 narratives. If you have wonderful technology and all the pillars of sustainable development work right, well, this is a case where all the countries are happily growing. The only issue is how to equitably distribute within the countries. Because you know the famous joke about Bill Gates, that if Bill Gates goes in to have a beer in the pub, the average income in that pub has risen to over $1 billion, right? And that's true. Statistically, it's true. But it's a matter of distribution, right? So that's the point I have here. Now, let's see. If we have rapid technological advances, but we don't get sustainable development quite right, then some countries will buckle. Either in the economic dimension, or the social dimension, or the environmental dimension. there can be adverse feedback loops. But because technology is advancing quite fast, you can still have globally some slack. So if you're smart enough, then you redistribute from the countries which are winners to the countries which are losers. So that's the kind of world we are in here. Now, what happens if we get sustainable development right, but we don't manage to either generate the technology or distribute the technology, and we have a binding constraint that we hit. There's an abrupt halt in the traditional growth model, which all the countries have followed, starting with the UK in the 17th century, and then US later, and so on. But that growth model will no longer be it will no longer be available. We still have some reserves that we can redirect to preserve an acceptable equilibrium. And then when we come to this case, which is the worst case, there is an abrupt halt in traditional growth model, chaotic response, and possibly a downward spiral globally. All right, this was just to give you an idea that you can actually, if you get things right, and I'm not claiming that I did, you can substitute 4 distinct stories for the infinite number of futures. Okay, so that's one way of looking forward into the future without getting dizzy. Let me stop here. Thank you very much for your attention. Please ask questions.
Thank you, Balazs. Please, questions, comments, discussion?
Yeah, thank you. So I would like to come back to the fact that we have just one Earth, and it's calculated that we would need 3, and that the current growth pattern cannot or should not be followed by developing countries. And I know that you are not saying what is right or what is wrong, but for some reason, from a moral perspective, it seems utterly wrong to tell developing countries why countries with high HDI were developing the welfare nations on colonization and also on brown growth, that you should follow another path. And I mean, if I were somewhat short-sighted and perhaps paranoid leader from China or from Asia, I might think that now that your growth has stopped, you just want to somehow blackmail me with this argument that we have one Earth, so what can you provide for me? And also, still, countries with high HDR are the ones who are emitting the most CO2. So what are you going to do? What are you going to sacrifice? What are you offering me? This is one thing. And the question that also countries with high HDI levels has low fertility levels, and vice versa. So countries with low HDI level has high fertility level. And also in the 2001 Human Development Report, there was a very good section on women letting exercising reproductive choices. So how do you see the role of this component, whether it might help or not? And the third question is, what do you think about giving more time to politicians? Would that help to change their short-sighted or low horizon?
When you say giving more time to politicians, you
like
mean?
Instead of 4 years, have elections for 6 years, I don't know.
First of all, your first question. That has to do about whether this is morally right. I can tell you, it's not morally right. But if there is a piano falling out of the 6th floor, and I look up and I say, this is morally wrong, this should not be falling on me. So what do? Do I say, it's morally wrong, therefore I'm not going to move? It's the wrong decision.
You were the wrong.
Yes. Maybe I set things in motion. Maybe I still run like hell.
Yeah.
Right? My point is that it is a fact that we are facing this situation. Yes, we can discuss who was at fault, and yes, the fault is clearly with the countries that have industrialized earlier. And And not only because they have industrialized earlier, they have actually actively held back through colonization many of the countries which are now catching up. That having been said, it is not productive to talk too much about the moral issues. It is far more productive to figure out what can be done now. And I have offered a couple of thoughts. And let me just point to some of the facts. The biggest producer of solar panels today in the world is China. It's no longer the US, not the European Union, even taken together, it's China. China has realized that they actually have to do something. And while they continue to argue the moral case, and they continue to argue that there is a need for support from countries which have the most advanced technologies, they no longer just wait for that technology to be transferred. They actually are at the forefront in several technologies. And similar things apply to a number of other countries. Again, I share your view. This is morally wrong. But you need to move on, and you need to figure out what can be done. And there are fairly obvious ways in which the countries that have industrialized much earlier, that they can compensate. And that has to do through technology transfer. There are all kinds of problems associated with this, but look at Norway, for example, which has been financing RED, which is saving the forests, to the tune of billions of dollars. A small country. Also, there are now huge funds that are being set up specifically for technology transfer, and those are mainly funded by developed countries. Am I saying this is enough? No. Am I saying that something is beginning to move? Yes. Now, I would turn it around. Give me specifics. What can be done? I can assure you, if you give me a great idea, I'll run with it. So this should be more a discussion about what can be done, what are the specific ideas that can be used in Africa, in China, in India. And I have heard a couple, and I'll be happy to talk. We won't have time, but there are great ideas that are being used through microfinance or various ways of sustainable eco-villages, for example. There are several in Africa. You talked about fertility and HDI being negatively correlated. Actually, there is a huge drop in fertility in almost all countries in the world in the past 10 years. It was astonishing for the UN who are making these regular demographic projections. It's still not enough to completely halt the overall number of people living on Earth, but the increase has slowed down tremendously. So that correlation actually is weakening. That said, yes, I do think women should make their decisions on reproductive health. I'm not one of those who says that I have a moral right, being religious, I tell all the women they can't have abortions. I would say, please don't have abortions, it's your decision. And whatever you decide, we'll try to help. So that's on reproductive health. And the politicians and the span, Lukashenko has tried to help you in that. And I don't think that the actual outcome shows that this is the right way to go. But joke aside, I see the problem. I don't think this is the solution. Okay?
Because you said about that we should provide the technology as to developing countries to avoid these problems that we had. It's nice and interesting idea, but actually I want to ask about renewable energy. And I was in Denmark, and I had really interesting lecture with the representative of Danish government. And he said something very enthusiastically, like, you know, we can earn money on development aid. For example, let's take one power project. We deliver some windmill to Poland. I'm from Poland, so. And of course we gave them for free, but right now they need to repair them, they need our support, help, and so on and so on. And actually we earn on development aid. So for me it's a business as usual, yes. So of course, so my question is how to provide the technology, yes? Because actually the technology is our, yes, it's European technology. If we sell it Not anymore, maybe, yes, of course.
The European,
maybe
China
is the same.
There are remarkable advances
but
in
United
Africa,
States.
a number of places.
Actually, I have an extension to that question. I just want to know about the patenting which is come over nowadays. So how do you actually patenting? Isn't that a hindrance to technology transfer, especially to the underdeveloped and developing countries?
Good point. So there was patenting, and there was whether this was business as usual. In my mind, even earning profit on this is not a major problem as long as you recycle that profit. Earning profit, pocketing it, and then walking away. No. Mohammed Yunus actually has 50, can't show 50 with my two hands, but 50 large enterprises, which are social enterprises, and they unashamedly earn profit, except all that profit by the regulations of those enterprises are recycled to further the original aim of the social enterprise. This is true for microfinance. They actually charge interest. They cover their costs and they even earn a little profit. But then that raises the capital of the microfinance institution, and then they give even more loans. So it's not the existence of the profit, it's what you do with the profit, which in my mind makes the big difference. And actually, if you are a profit-oriented entity, you will be more efficient than if you just give things away. There is also, on the receiving side, there is also an incentive issue. In Africa, when they tried to combat malaria, they tried giving away bed nets. And what they found, people took it. Actually, fishermen took dozens of it because then they could use it for fishing, which was the wrong thing. They began to charge very low nominal amounts, incredibly low, like 1 cent. And it changed the attitude. And mothers were then told, look, it's in your interest to actually have a bed net, and your child will most probably not die of malaria. This is from the president of Tanzania. The number of children dying from malaria in Africa are equivalent to a giant jumbo jet crashing into Kilimanjaro every day. So it's a huge issue. And how you tackle it makes a big difference. And very often, some signals are not the obvious signals that you want to give. Sometimes it actually makes sense to charge little amounts, which people can afford. But then they actually take this seriously. And sometimes it is not a bad idea to have profit-seeking entities helping out. That was my point about the market being a major driving force. It can be a driving force in development as well. Patents. Patents are society's way of rewarding inventive people for the inventions that they have. In general, patents are for X number of years, and they confer a temporary monopoly for the person who has come up with a brilliant idea. That monopoly can be used for profits. This is the incentive. In the US, it's for 17 years. Don't ask me why. After 17 years, the patent expires, and that's when, for example, in the case of medicines, that's when generics come in. The idea is used. Generic medicine makers actually use that idea. For 17 years, they are locked up, so that the inventor can collect on the invention. After 17 years, generics can take over. This is some kind of compromise, not necessarily the best, but it's a reasonable compromise to ensure that inventions are generated. Also, there is a very specific problem with ideas. Just suppose you have a brilliant idea, you want to sell it. You go to someone, hey, I want to sell my idea. What's your idea? You tell them, they say, they walk away, and then next day they use it. Right? So there is this very specific problem with ideas and making money out of ideas, and patents are, to some extent, again, an attempt to address this kind of problem. So, is it a perfect system? No. Is it a reasonable system? I would actually argue half reasonable. Now, there are times when you have to override the patent. When they had this idea of combating HIV/AIDS, not by a single medicine, but by a cocktail, and then the composition of the cocktail. The person who came up with that was not compensated through a patent. Because it was such a great idea, and there were so many millions waiting, so they couldn't wait for 17 years. And now in Africa, in Southeast Asia, these kinds of cocktails are made available at a very low cost. Back to the private sector, it's Bill Gates who actually puts up the money for this. Governments have not been able to come around the problem. It's a private sector entity. Bill Gates put in billions into it. So my solution, get the private sector, all the energy into the right directions, and try to use government to facilitate it. And patent is one intervention from the government's side, which tries to strike this kind of balance. We have 7 more minutes. Yes. Please.
I have a question about regional economic sustainable development. You've mentioned the case of Central Asia and the problem of the upstream countries versus the downstream countries. So I'm as I come from the region, I'm very interested to see your view on a possible solution. Is it an unreconcilable problem, or do you see that there might be a possible solution?
This is one of those cases where in game theory you would say within that game it's going to be a suboptimal. But happily you can change the rules of the game. And what I mean by that, if you have Tajikistan, Kyrgyzstan, Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan, and Kazakhstan individually trying to optimize, it's not going to go very well. On the other hand, the costs are so obvious by now that even in those countries, or at least several of them, there is now the recognition that somehow they have to optimize on a broader level, at the regional level. Is it easy? No, it's awfully hard. I mean, just try to get the Uzbek and the Tajik leader in the same room at the same time. Or there are various other pairings which will not work. But it is so obvious to the detriment of millions of people. And there is a Fergana Valley, which 3 countries share. And very obviously that has to be irrigated. So a lot of things which, taken together, will at some point hopefully make the politicians realize that there is something they need to do. It's not a very, I know, it's an answer which is not very convincing or smashing answer, but this is where we stand. UNDP actually works on this. We call it a complex crisis because it has to do with energy generation, it has to do with social aspects, it has to do with agriculture and rural development, and also with trade. So a lot of things interact, but it is very clear that where we are is a suboptimal equilibrium, and where we want to be is a higher level.
Yeah, I want to bring it back to the experience of less developing countries. On the first day of the class, we learned that most of the developing countries, the states have been captured, meaning that the governments are very corrupt, institutions do not function very well. So in that case, if the states are being captured and then the private sector cannot deliver because we don't have the adequate capital to undertake investments. So now you are advocating for allowing the market to determine how resources can be allocated. So my question is this. One, the state is not functioning well. The private sector, they don't have the capital to invest. How can we then rely on the market to, encourage or promote sustainable development?
I have to say, this is an excellent question. I lived in Tanzania for 2 years, so I have some knowledge of this. Let me first start by the statement that not only do markets fail, governments also fail. And what you have described is a very clear instance of government failure. Now, just as in the case of market failure, there are remedies. There are also possible remedies for government failure, and that has to do with democratic governance. And UNDP's activities comprise, to a very large extent, activities in this area. We work with governments and we work with communities on making the governance structures more effective. Now, you talked about state capture. It's actually not a privilege of only African countries or developing countries. There are several developed countries where there has been near complete state capture of the state by special interests. Indeed, if that is the problem, you have to first focus on the government failure, and you have to begin fixing that. It's, there is someone who has two wounds. You look at which is the bigger, and you try to address that first. You stabilize the other, but you address the bigger one, or the life-threatening one. And what you're pointing out is there are cases, and indeed you are correct, where it's the government failure, which is the bigger one, which is the life-threatening one. Now, let me just mention one thing, that you said that in these countries there is not adequate capital. In a sense, you're right, but not in the sense that it is not creation. It is actually taken out of the country. There's capital flight. Because if it's a very poor country, yes, there will be less accumulation. But then there are obvious investments which you can actually do with relatively little money. So in relative terms, there is always a lot of possibilities for gainful investment. But exactly in the situation that you described, when there is a government failure, then people will just take their money out, and that money will be parked in Swiss bank accounts or in a neighboring country. What you have to do is to address those failures, and they will not be simple. But at the end of the day, actually, private sector again can step in. There is a prize for governance, the best governed, I think, country in Africa, and that prize is the richest man in Africa.
Oh, Ibrahim.
Yes, Mr. Ibrahim. He has put up a significant amount of money, specifically trying to guide politicians towards addressing this problem that you have described. Again, the private sector can sometimes be helpful. And again, do I have a simple solution for you? No. But I do think that somehow striking a balance between first addressing the most life-threatening failure, which is government failure in these instances, working at the community level, because this can be actually improved from the community level, and there it's easier. In a single village, it's easier to convince the elders or the old women who usually are the opinion formers. And once you get moving there, then you can do that in several other villages. And next thing you know, you have done it in many, many different places, and that can, together, that can begin to make a difference at the national level. So there are ideas. I don't have one single answer for you. It's too good a question.
You mentioned something about
last question, please, because
you mentioned something about getting the price of energy right. For us that do not have energy at all, are you already punishing us for inefficiency? Because the government already is using it against the people. January 1st, we lost our fuel subsidy, and it has been creating a lot of sensations in Nigeria up till now, because even the subsidy was looted, and the addition in price will be looted too. The second thing I need to ask is there a way for local government to be better engaged at the global level? For example, you talked about the issue of mosquito nets being used for fishing nets. I
come from Anambra State in Nigeria. We have a typical example of things that are going wrong like that. Mosquito nets was distributed free of charge, even by international donors. It got to the extent of poor marketing. The local media wasn't engaged in the distribution. People didn't get things right. The mosquito nets were just distributed, and they didn't know that you had to hang it out for 24 hours because of the chemical, so that before you start using it. People who slept in that mosquito net ended up in the hospitals. And people who heard the story, that was how the issue of that mosquito net became a disaster. So there is a need to engage the global organizations, to engage directly to the local governments. Forget about the national and regional governments. You must come down to the local governments so that the people understand what is going on.
I almost fully agree with you. I would say don't forget about the national government. You have to engage them. There's no way around it. However, definitely, absolutely do not forget about the local. Because local communities are there. You can do the convincing and you can do the effective distribution. Let me just say, subsidies, energy subsidies are regressive. Poor people, yes, they benefit from it, but rich people benefit far more. If you have 6 trucks and you fill them every week, in totality you get far more from that, you capture more from that subsidy than if you are a poor person who, I don't know, uses kerosene for lighting.
But there is no alternative. You don't have rail lines, you don't have use inland water services. There is no alternative. That is the issue.
Okay, so what I'm saying to them is get a plan and do this gradually. And tell everyone I'm going to remove the subsidies in 3 years. In 3 years I'll put in the alternative. Where do I get the money from? By not wasting it on the rich people. And asking donors to help. And use renewable energy. We have renewable energy used in many, in our region. Africa is not in our region, but there are others working in Africa who use renewable energy to provide lighting and small amounts of electricity. And it can be done, and Nigeria has an ample supply of sunshine, and the technology for solar panels is just incredible. Just in 3 years, efficiency has risen a lot. And the price, I mean, the 1 kilowatt or 1 watt from solar energy, how much it costs, that has dropped by 4-fold in just a few years. So there are alternatives. Realize the regressive nature of subsidies. Realize that fiscal space is opened up by stopping subsidies. Of course, take into account the very good point we're raising, that is that you can't do this overnight. You have to do this over some period. These things can be put together into a reasonable approach that will get rid of the subsidies over time and compensate those among the vulnerable who suffer from the economy. Again, let's discuss it about it. We have time.
Okay, last question. 5 minutes already. Can you combine in two because this is
I would like to give a small remark about the social enterprises, because in the region, maybe in Slovenia, Hungary, and Slovakia, but I see that the social enterprises, they are coming from NGOs, so the civil organizations, and they really want to be sustainable in a human way, so providing employment, but they can't be sustainable in an economical way because they are coming from the civil society and they don't have enough knowledge to work in the business and to have that way of thinking. And I don't know, what do you think about it? And the other is that we were talking about the responsibility of the private sector, and what I see mainly after the economic crisis that many money was cut off because of the economic crisis, and they don't want to spend on CSR, and that who should encourage it and how.
UNDP works on both these areas, CSR and on social enterprises. CSR is generally for larger enterprises, and those are the ones who take this up.
CSR is corporate social responsibility.
Those generally have survived the crisis, but yes, they have cut back significantly. It's cyclical. We just have to live with the fact that expenditures on corporate social responsibility are cyclical. You know, when times are good, there is more money. When times are not so good, then there is less money. And there is nothing we can do that. It's a given. So in that sense, I don't really have a solution for that. In terms of social enterprises, UNDP works with them. We actually have guidebooks for how to operate in this environment. We also help with workshops in trying to help them to come up with a business plan that actually flies, that actually works, adds up. So there is some support, and we would be happy to talk with you. We have a lot
We have Piotr and Justina on Thursday next week.
Okay, so I was going to mention the Polish experience. Do ask them. They can tell you a lot of specifics.
You mentioned at the beginning that politicians only optimize and think on the short term, which I connected with what you said in the last time, that's going to lead to a bumpy road, right? More or less.
Yes.
To complement Dora's question, what should we do? Should we increase the time that politicians have to think about it? Or in addition, in the same time, invest in education? Because you propose a solution which is peer pressure, global collective action, and enhancing the reputational effects, but is it a priority or imperative to educate the masses, to sanction politicians? I mean, to educate the masses in the sense of understanding the reforms and how much time we should give them, and I don't know, try to avoid this manipulation, and perhaps this would help. I mean, do you think it's a relevant part or an important thing that we should do right now, or it can just, come along if it does?
I see your point, and again, this is me. There is no single solution. I think the main thrust of attack should be transparency. If a politician makes a certain decision, that decision needs to be known by everyone in society, and he will need to explain why exactly he or she did that. And then accountability. And that's what elections are about. That's basically a very crude mechanism to ensure accountability. I don't like what this politician did, so next time I don't vote for it. Now, there is a whole lot that needs to be done by civil society. And I mentioned the role of civil society as a watchdog, think tanks, and various other institutions can be put in place that actually educate what you said, educate the broad swaths of society. I think that this is a process that has taken hundreds of years in the most advanced democracies. There's no way around it. You just have to slowly build towards that. Local level work is also critical, because there is big politics at the country level, and then there is small local level politics. And people's lives are often more touched by local level politics. And there, again, because lower number of players are involved, information is actually far better. In little villages, people know what their leaders are up to. And it is actually easier once you get a reasonable amount of accountability and transparency in place at the local level. It is actually easier to affect change. And then again, you can build up by replicating at the local level a very large number of times. You can build up towards a national level. At the national level, it's very hard. Politicians are masters at manipulating public opinion. They are masters at spending right before elections and creating a feel-good factor. If you look at the actual graphs of deficits before elections, you can be assured there's a significantly higher deficit than after elections or any other time. So yes, there are all kinds of problems associated with this. You just
thank you. I suggest that we stop.